Hey everybody.
Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. We're excited to have you here. Before we get started, a couple of items I just wanted to mention. The session is being recorded, and we'll be sending out the recording afterwards so you can revisit anything we cover or share it with your colleagues. We'll also leave time at the end for questions and answers. So, as things come to mind, feel free to drop them into the chat and we'll circle back to them towards the end. For those of you that I have not met yet, my name is Jenna. I'm the local account executive with Paylocity in the area. Paylocity is a leading provider for HCM technology, and I am joined today by Riley, founder and CEO of Triumph HR. Riley, would you like to say hi again?
Hey everybody. So excited to be here with you.
Awesome. Our goal today is to walk through some of the most common blind spots that we see in HR environments. Excuse me, especially when people, processes, and systems don't fully align. This is meant to be educational and practical, not product focused, so that by the end of today, you can walk away with ideas that actually apply to your organization. Man, I ate something really quick before I jumped on, and excuse me. This next idea can seem a little bit uncomfortable, but it's incredibly common. The HR setup that helped your organization grow to where it is today is often the same one that's quietly holding you back. Excuse me. What worked for teams that were smaller and processes that were simpler starts to break down as complexity increases. More employees, more compliance, more moving parts. And instead of processes evolving intentionally, organizations often add quick fixes, new spreadsheets, new steps, new tools. Over time, that creates friction that slows everything down. And that's exactly where the blind spots we're about to discuss begin to show up. Before we dive in, sorry, before we dive in, we'd like to hear from you. So if you can take a look at the screen and think about which of these feel familiar to your organization or maybe your client's organization. We know you're all coming from different areas. Is HR constantly in reactive mode, putting out fires instead of building? Are managers making people decisions without the right data or support? Do key processes like payroll compliance or onboarding rely on tribal knowledge instead of consistent workflows? Or is leadership asking HR to become more strategic, but the team is buried in administrative work? Or maybe you're not sure where your systems are solving problems or just adding steps. If one of those resonates with you, go ahead and drop it in the chat, 1 through 5, and we'll discuss further.
I think it's so interesting because it's hard, I would imagine, for small businesses and HR teams to truly pick a number 1 through 5. So if you're sitting there being like, I cannot just choose one, that is incredibly relatable. And so many of the businesses that both Jenna and I support run into this so frequently. You're not alone in feeling that way.
That's true, Riley. It's definitely true. And as those responses come in, they're really the themes that we run into every single day when we're talking to organizations. One of the
Absolutely.
most common patterns we see is that HR friction initially looks like a people problem. It might feel like communication breakdowns, missteps, inconsistent execution, but more often than not, when we look back, take a step back and look at the bigger picture, the root issue isn't people. It's that systems and processes surrounding them are not set up correctly. And when the system is unclear, inconsistent, or disconnected, even strong teams struggle. But when you fix the system, many of the people problems actually start to disappear on their own. By the end of our time together today, our goal is that you leave with a much clearer picture of where your HR setup may be leaking efficiency and why those gaps aren't always where you expect them to be. We'll walk through some of the most common blind spots we see across organizations, and they're more common than you think, and more importantly, why they matter. We'll also introduce a simple diagnostic framework that you can use immediately, whether you're evaluating your current setup or supporting your clients through similar challenges. And finally, we want to help you leave with clarity on the right next steps and what they look like from where your organization or your clients are right now. That sets the stage for where what we're going to explore today. Riley brings a hands-on strategic perspective from working directly with organizations facing these exact challenges. So Riley, I'm going to turn it on over to you. Grab another drink of water so that you can start us unpacking what these blind spots actually look like in the real world.
Yeah, Jenna, you're absolutely right. Where all of these problems tend to show as people problems, but they're actually not. And let's talk about what that looks like. I want you to think about the last time something went sideways in your organization, a termination that was very messy, a complaint that came out of nowhere, a manager who just couldn't hold their team together. I would be willing to bet that if you traced it back far enough, the root was not a bad employee or a bad manager. But most often, the hard truth is that the organization did not set people up to succeed. And the place where that almost always starts is with leadership misalignment. And once you see where the gaps are, unfortunately, you won't be able to unsee them. So let's talk more about what that looks like in practice. Raise your hand if you have ever been in a meeting where something went wrong and everybody looks at each other saying, wait, wasn't that your job? Whose job was that? I can guarantee almost every single one of us has been there at some place in time. And that is what we call the ownership gap. And here's how it plays out in real life. Shared accountability sounds collaborative, but what it actually means is that when something slips, everyone can point to somebody else. It's a game of hot potato. Managers are making people decisions every single day on pay, on performance, on flexibility, without any guardrails telling them what they're actually empowered to do. So HR spends your time cleaning up decisions that never should have been made in the first place. Not because anyone was malicious, but because nobody defined the lanes for people to operate in. And the whole function then end up being reactive, not by choice, but by design. This translates into several things. Decisions that cannot move, or they move at a snail's pace because nobody's sure who's actually making the call. An HR function that is burnt out from carrying the weight that was never theirs. Leaders who get pulled back into the operational weeds when they're supposed to be thinking strategically. And the most visible cost at all that you will hear me talk about today again and again is a culture that varies depending upon the manager that you report to. Sure, maybe it's the same company, same handbook, same processes, but it is a completely different experience. And that is not a coincidence. That is what happens when accountability is not intentionally designed. And that allows us to go into our next blind spot. The first blind spot we talked about was who owns the work. This one is about who owns the decision. And those two things are so interconnected more than most teams realize. Because when ownership is unclear, decision making becomes guesswork. Who's deciding and who's just advising? Most teams cannot answer that clearly. So, what happens there? Managers start filling the gaps themselves, not because they're bad managers, but because no one gave them the framework to follow. And now every manager is running their own version of the company. Different calls, different standards, different risk tolerance. And when something goes wrong, you're not just dealing with a bad decision, you're dealing with a system that never decided how decisions should be made in the first place. This is where it all starts to show up, and it happens incredibly fast. Employees start having completely different experiences depending upon who they report to, which creates silos. Decisions are made in isolation without visibility across the business. Managers start second guessing themselves because when you're not sure what the right call is, every decision feels murky and uncertain. And it creates this tension at a leadership level because now no one's aligned on how the business should be run. So, what started as a we just need to move quickly turns into a system where no one is actually rowing in the same direction. And this is the part that most companies underestimate. Manager quality is not just a factor of engagement, it is the factor of engagement. 70% of your employees feel about their job comes down to their manager. So when managers are not set up to lead well, it does not stay isolated. It impacts culture, retention, performance, literally everything. And at the same time, more than half of managers are stepping into a role with little or no formal training. So we have this huge gap where expectations are high, but support is low. And we're asking people to lead without ever really teaching them how to. And that gap is where all of those issues that we just talked about start to take root. And this is where it shows up as a quote unquote manager problem. But if we zoom out, it's not really about capability, it's about what we did or didn't equip them with. We promote people into management without giving them the tools to actually lead. So we get avoidance, inconsistency, or issues that build quietly until they become these huge catastrophic problems that nobody can run from and everybody's fighting the fire. And by the time that we notice, it feels like, oh no, this came out of nowhere, but it didn't. And it was never addressed early, is the issue. And this is where it stops becoming just an internal leadership issue and shows up across the business. You start to see turnover, culture starts to fragment, and legal risk creeps in because decisions are not being made consistently or documented clearly. It all boils down to the fact that this is where disengagement starts. And the thread through all of this is simple. Your culture is not what is written in your handbook. It is what your managers reinforce every single day. And if that is not designed incredibly intentionally, you are going to feel it here. So, when something goes wrong, a performance issue, a complaint, a termination, our instinct is to look at the person. What did they do? How do we fix them or it? Do we need to take any action? But if everything we talked about is true, then we have to pause and ask a different question first. Is this actually a people problem or is this a system problem showing up through a person? Because if the system isn't clear, then fixing the person doesn't actually fix the problem. It just shows up again and again. The organizations that get this right don't react, they diagnose and they build systems that prevent the issue in the first place. And that is where Jenna's going to take us next. How you actually operationalize all of this through your systems and tools that support the entire organization at every level.
Thanks, Riley. Yeah, so when misalignments exist, it doesn't stay hidden. It starts showing up in very specific places across an organization. Sometimes it appears in onboarding, where steps get skipped or duplicated, sometimes in compliance, where documentation isn't consistent, sometimes in reporting, when numbers don't align across teams, and sometimes in leadership decisions where data arrives too late to act on effectively. Those aren't isolated problems, they're systems. They're symptoms of a system that are slightly out of sync. And in the next section, we're going to walk through exactly where those gaps tend to show up and how to recognize them before they become bigger issues. Thanks for switching that slide over. So, payroll, right? We're talking about payroll exposes misalignment. So, as we talked about, once misalignment exists, it tends to surface in very specific areas across an organization. And one of the places it becomes visible the fastest is payroll. Payroll is often where misalignment gets exposed first, but it's not because payroll itself is the problem, but because it touches so many different parts of your organization. When when people, processes, and systems that aren't fully aligned, there's small breakdowns that start showing up here. You might have unimproved pay changes where adjustments are happening outside of a clear workflow. You start seeing manual corrections becoming routine instead of the exception. During a benefit cycle, there may be enrollment errors or confusion, especially when data is moving between systems. And over time, you end up with reporting that doesn't really match reality, which makes it difficult for leadership to trust the numbers that they're reviewing. Systems expose misalignment. One of the fastest ways to identify misalignment is in an organization through its systems. Because when systems aren't aligned with processes, the consequences become visible very quickly, especially in payroll. Looking at the data, about 50% of employees begin job searching after experiencing just 2 paycheck mistakes. We all know that this is the livelihood of your employees. This is a powerful reminder that payroll accuracy just isn't an operational issue, but that it impacts retention and trust. And on the organization side, 53% of companies have been hit with payroll penalties in the last 5 years. That tells us these challenges aren't rare, they're happening across industries. And every single error carries a real cost. On average, $291 to correct before penalties are even factored in. So when we're talking about misalignment, we're not just talking about inconvenience. We're talking about risk, cost, and employee confidence. Blind spot number 4. Another blind spot we see pretty often is processes technically exist, but not but it's not truly repeatable. On paper, there's process, but in reality, the steps live in someone's head. Usually, the person that's been there the longest, right? We've all run into that. Over time, expectations start becoming the norm. Approvals happen in hallway conversations, direct messages, or quick side emails. And the biggest risk here is that there's no consistent documentation trail. So if something goes wrong or if someone leaves, an organization loses visibility into how things were actually getting done. We see this most clearly during turnover when suddenly no one knows how a task was really being handled. There's a downstream effect to this. So when processes aren't repeatable, the downstream effect starts to stack up. Workaround slowly becoming the actual workflow. And when knowledge lives in people's heads instead of in systems, those processes walk out the door when people leave. Without clear documentation, every transition, it's a turnover, promotion, a role change. It becomes a risk event. And that documentation trail, without it, it becomes very difficult to defend decisions or show consistency. And ultimately, that creates hidden compliance exposure that organizations mostly don't even realize that they have. Blind spot number 5. The next blind spot we're going to see is disconnected systems. This is something that I run into very often with organizations. Um, how many systems can an organization have? It happens a lot when organizations find that they've grown. They started with one system, they acquire, they put on other systems to try to solve an issue. We've got payroll, HRIS, benefits, time tracking, ATS, the list can go on, each living in separate places. Even when integrations exist on paper, reconciliation often still happens in spreadsheets. That usually leads to duplicate data entry, time taken up, and that's where errors are born. So when systems don't fully communicate, nobody has a single source of truth. Different teams are looking at different numbers and spending time trying to figure out which one is right. That's where productivity quietly disappears, frustrations build, and time is wasted. There's an operational cost to this, right? So when systems and processes aren't aligned, the operational cost shows up in ways that are easy to underestimate. It seems easy to just think, I'm just going to continue this task, do it a different time, put it in a different system, but you start seeing duplicate work across teams. Manual errors begin impacting payroll, benefits, reporting, lost hours, are spent, pulling in spreadsheets, sometimes every single pay period, reconciling things. Data starts conflicting across systems. And without a reliable source of truth, leadership ends up making decisions with incomplete information. And that's where cost can really compound, not just in time, but also in confidence. Creating a ripple effect. When outdated data drives decisions, the ripple effect spreads across an organization. Leaders are making decisions based on stale data. Problems get identified only after they escalate. Early signals, especially around turnover and retention, are often missed. Leadership becomes reactive instead of proactive, and HR teams get stuck reporting on the past instead of shaping what happens next. And that's when organizations lose momentum without even realizing it. Next slide. I love webinars. The real cost, right? So let's talk about the real cost. Because when we look at industry data, these challenges are not isolated at all. 81% of companies say poor system integrations limit their ability to meet HR goals. Nearly 1 in 5 teams are still doing manual work that software could handle automatically. And half of HR leaders say their technology doesn't match their current or future business needs. This is where benchmarking and looking at your entire organization structure makes sense. This isn't just an operational issue, it's a strategic one. Integration, people, processes, and systems. Success doesn't come from just strengthening one of these areas, it comes from the integration of all three. When people understand expectations, when processes are clear and repeatable, and when systems reinforce, not complicate the workflow, that's when organizations begin to operate with consistency and confidence. But one of these elements falls behind or evolves separately from the others, that's where misalignment starts to surface. Here's the test. When we evaluate HR environments, we typically start with three foundational elements: people, process, systems. Which one is your pain point? Which one is your driver? First, people. This includes expectations, capability, and accountability. Do people understand what's expected? Do they have the tools and the knowledge to execute? And is there accountability when things don't go as planned? Second, process. This is about repeatable workflows and consistency, not just knowing what to do, but making sure that it's done the same way every single time. And the third is systems. These are the tools that reinforce the workflow, not work around it. When one of these areas is misaligned, friction starts showing up across the organization. And the real impact happens when these three elements don't move together. Before we move forward, I'd like to get a quick pulse on where your HR function sits today. So take a look at the options on the screen. Are you fully? Oh, I just got that too, Riley,
Love
because
it.
I love it. I should answer it. I'm sorry, because when you look at it, where are you currently in your HR processes? Are you fully reactive? Are you always in fire mode? Mostly reactive with pockets of strategy. We're getting there. Mostly intentional, but gaps remain. Or are you fully intentional and proactive?
Yeah,
As
everybody go
these
it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as these numbers start to come in, Riley, can you talk to us about how to leave a reactive state and more into an intentional state?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the answers that are coming through at this moment in time. Nobody has said yet that they're in fully reactive mode. And I just want to relate to you that if you are, and you might say, I don't know that I want to answer that way, it's completely okay. We work with organizations all of the time who are in that situation. The house might be on fire, or they're coming in and saying, I don't know what I don't know. And can you help us figure out what that is so we can move to a very intentional place? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share the results. So we do have some people here who are saying we're mostly reactive with pockets of strategy. So we're getting there. And we have a few who are saying we're mostly intentional, but some gaps remain. And that's completely normal to have happen in an organization. So, how do we move from reactive to intentional? I can tell you this: most HR functions do not want to be reactive. Nobody wakes up thinking, I'd love to spend my day putting out fires and cleaning up issues. The goal is always to be more strategic, more proactive, more forward looking. But what happens is the day to day pulls you back in. There's a situation, a question, a decision that needs to be made, and it needs to be made now. And before you know it, you're back in reaction mode. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because the structure underneath is not fully defined yet. And that's when the business has to rely on people to fill the gaps in real time. This shift is not about trying harder or adding more to your plate. It's about stepping back and intentionally designing how this should actually work. That's what moves from reactive to something that is consistent, scalable, and intentional, all with confidence. So, how do we actually get there and move out of the reactive mode? Again, it is not by doing more, but by doing things in the right order. First, we need to be diagnosing where are the gaps and where are things breaking down. Then we need to be very intentional about how we design that structure through ownership and decisions, and then using systems like Jenna was saying to reinforce it. A huge piece of this is equipping your managers to execute and building visibility so leadership can actually trust what they are seeing. Because if you skip this order, you don't fix the problem, you just make it more complex. How do we actually know how to diagnose what's really going on? We want to leave you with something incredibly practical because this only matters if you can actually use it, right? This is the simplest way to diagnose what's really going on underneath the hood when something feels off in your organization. Anytime there's an issue or performance concern, a messy decision, or a breakdown somewhere along the way, pause and run it through these four questions. One, is ownership clear? Meaning, does everyone actually know who owns this final decision? Is the process repeatable? Or does it depend on who's involved and what day it is? Is leadership behavior consistent? Are managers handling this the same way, or are they each kind of doing their own thing? And finally, do your systems support this, or are they forcing workarounds? Because if the answer to any of these questions is no, you're not dealing with a people problem. You're looking at a gap in your system. And that's something that we need to fix. So, when we think through and wrap all of this up, if you take nothing else from today, I would anchor on this. Most of what feels like a people problem is usually a misalignment problem coming across people, process, and systems. It is not effort, it's not intent, it's how everything is working or not working together. Clarity is what drives everything. Clear ownership, clear decision making, clear expectations. That is what creates consistency. That is what builds trust. And that is what allows managers to lead effectively. But that clarity cannot just live in talking conversations. It has to show up in your processes and be reinforced through your systems because your systems are what make the consistency real. They're what turn this is how we should operate, or we want to operate this way, into this is how we actually operate every single day. So if you're not sure where your biggest gap is, that's usually the best place to start a conversation. This is exactly both the work that Jenna and Triumph HR does, helping organizations get clear on their structure and then making sure their systems actually support that structure itself. So if you want to talk through your specific setup, we'd both be happy to connect after this. But again, pinpoint that one workflow that was we're talking, you're like, this is where we need to fix. I know right now on a sticky note, I just wrote that down. Identifying where things are misaligned and bringing clarity to the ownership and structure while leveraging systems to embed that into our daily operations. So, as we close it out, we'll open it up for any questions coming through and happy to dig into anything that we've covered or talk through a specific situation that you're navigating. I have a few questions that came through as we were going through, Jenna. The first one I have here is everything feels like a priority. How do we know where to start? Do you have any advice?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the three buckets, right? We're talking about people, process, product. Which one is your biggest pain point? And if you're talking about people, what are the people's expectations and what is the accountability there? So that's one place to start. You talk about products. How many products are we talking about? Have you benchmarked lately? Have you looked into the industry and what are the company priorities that you have? And that third bucket, same priority. You just got to break it out, Riley. You just got to find out which one is the biggest pain and break it down from there.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Like, where is the pain the highest right now? And that's probably where you need to look at first and foremost. If things are feeling inconsistent or messy, that's typically where your biggest gap is. And then I hear this question all of the time, right? Like HR and maybe one or two people in leadership are ready to make a change, but maybe our managers aren't ready. How do we approach that? And I think it's so important. And this one's a little bit hard to come by, but we don't want to be waiting for perfect managers. We want to be building a system that supports them where they are and help them get better over time. Because I think if we wait for them, I don't know that they'll ever be ready, but we need to teach them and train them and coach them along the way.
Absolutely, Riley. Makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions come in at the moment. We so appreciate everybody's time. And as Jenna mentioned in the beginning, everybody will be receiving the slides and the recording within the next few days. And if there are questions that come up afterwards, you'll have all of our contact information, and we look forward to talking with you.
Excellent. Thanks
Thanks,
everyone for
everyone.
joining.
Bye.